Okay, so this first video for properties of real numbers is going to be pretty quick. We've got all these vocabulary words describing different sets of real numbers. We've got real numbers, which is the big one, rational numbers, irrational numbers, integers, whole numbers, and natural numbers. So we've got this visualization that I'm going to give you, almost like a flow chart sort of thing. So start by drawing just a big rectangle here. Okay, so this whole big thing here represents the real numbers. Okay, so real numbers, that's basically everything that we know so far. Every number that you have ever heard of falls under the category of real numbers. Okay, so then within that, I want you to draw just a slightly smaller rectangle. Okay, so inside the category of real numbers, there are two different types of real numbers. There are rational numbers and irrational numbers. Okay, so divide here. So these will be the irrationals over here. And then these will be the rationals. Now the rationals have many more categories within that category, so we're going to leave, that's the only reason we have more space. This doesn't mean there are more rational numbers, there are actually more irrational numbers, but there are no further subcategories here, and there are more subcategories here. So remember, real numbers, anything at all. Rational numbers, if you remember from your vocabulary, is anything that can be written as a fraction. So like 2 over 3, or like negative 7 over 8, or something like that. And then irrational numbers, you've got things like pi, or the square root of 2, or something like that. Basically anything that can't be written as numerator over denominator. Okay, so then inside of the rational numbers, we've got yet another set. Okay, so I'm going to start drawing circles here. Okay, so the next subcategory inside the rational numbers is the integers. And integers, again, if you remember, are defined as positive or negative whole numbers. So like 2 or negative 4. And integers are also rational numbers, because think of like 2, for example, you could write it as 2 over 1, and that technically makes it a fraction. Inside the integers, we can get a little more specific. And we can say whole numbers. Okay, so whole numbers are basically 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So integers, but none of the negative ones. So integers could be positive or negative. Whole numbers do not include the negatives. And then they've got this category, final category, that they call natural numbers. Natural numbers are almost exactly the same as whole numbers, except they don't include 0. So natural numbers are just like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Whole numbers include the 0. Integers include the negatives. Rationals include any other fractions. So that's a pretty big category. And then irrational numbers are anything that can't be written as a fraction. So the examples I gave were like uneven square roots, or like pi, or other things like that. Okay, so this kind of shows how the categories fall within the other categories. Okay, example, we're going to look at a handful of numbers here and then categorize them. So you write any and all categories that they all fit into. So here's a hint. Every single one of them is a real number. So you're always going to give the answer of real number. So square root of 6. Square root of 6, it's definitely real, because like I said, they're all going to be. And then you go into the next category. Is it rational or is it irrational? So can it be written as a fraction or can it not? And it can't. Square root of 6 is some crazy decimal value. We can't write it as a fraction, and so it's irrational. So looking at this visualization, if it's irrational, it's not going to be any of these. So once you say it's irrational, you're done. Okay, next, the number 5. It is real. We know that. Like I said, they're all real. Is it rational or irrational? Well, it can be written as a fraction. You can write it as 5 over 1, so it's rational. And then we'll kind of go down the line. Is it an integer? Yeah. The denominator is just 1, so yeah, it's an integer. Is it a whole number? Meaning, is it non-negative? And yes, it's positive, so it's a whole number. And is it a natural number? Meaning, is it a positive number that's not 0? And yes, it's definitely a positive number that's not 0. Okay, next, on to negative 2/3. Again, every single one of these numbers is real. Is it rational or irrational? Can it be written as a fraction or can it not? Well, it's clearly written as a fraction, so it's rational. And then with this one, that's where we stop, because it's not an integer. Integers are positive or negative whole numbers, and it's not a whole number, it's a fraction of a whole number, so it's just real and rational. Negative square root of 9. We know it's a real number. Now this one is intentionally meant to be a little bit tricky, because you see a square root and you might think it's irrational, but the square root of 9 actually comes out evenly. So remember, this is actually the same as negative 3. So let's go from there. It's rational. So it can be written as a fraction. You can write it as negative 3 over 1. It is an integer. Remember, integers are positive or negative whole numbers. It is not a whole number because it's negative. So integers is the smallest subcategory that it falls into. All right, so that is your summary of real numbers.